You're
We're just live right now. Yeah. And then I'm gonna try.
The pre-live stuff is always fun.
Yeah.
I can start to work. Hospital it's about still hospital. The day before previously I was just going
Hi.
We're having so much fun.
Is that? Oh yeah, we are.
We're gonna grab a lot.
Actually, so I don't know if you're part of but there's a really popular one. Yeah.
No, I speak as now.
Right now, we haven't posted this ever people reading other and that's going to be up to what because yeah. It's a free event. I think but that also depends on like what kind of yeah.
And then to their side of Mark's is
So we definitely We definitely should have some kind of like ticketing system. Just like here's the art, this is expecting a lot of people. It's better to like have someone there like the artists. That's the like we can make sure. We start? All right.
Talk amongst yourselves.
Do you guys care which one?
So the microphone is over here. Nick and I have really booming voices, so we have to sit on the sides.
Oh, sure, sure.
I guess
Do you have a preference?
I don't have a preference.
Nor do I.
Obviously, you must choose which is your preference.
I'll just sit here. Fine.
I
And if you're comfortable with just like projecting, we actually don't even need these mics. Just because that mic is really the important one that connects to our online audience.
Okay.
We have this too. Whatever's clever. Okay. You're so picky.
Well, I see we're like, are we live already?
We are live already. Yeah.
Okay.
We can. That's the camera, so you don't want to wave high.
Thank you for coming, you guys.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Exciting.
Yeah.
indeed.
Cool. We have 9 people watching. Wow.
And one of them is my grandma, probably.
Really?
Well, the other one's my grandma. Look at you.
Sorry,
Gosh. So that leaves 6 people.
That's
Yeah, you're
nice and cozy.
we're streaming live to the Wang and Larson family, right?
Oh my gosh.
Hi, everyone.
All right, Peter, what do you think? You want to go to some cups?
So the consensus is we're starting a little bit late because we want to give people ample time to find parking. I assume you guys are here, so you found parking. Who's not here? So,
Oh, thank you.
yeah, so
Great
let's go ahead and kick it off. Ready?
All right, everybody, welcome to the 108th episode of Silicon Zombies, where we connect live with brilliant innovators, thinkers, and entrepreneurs. We're super thrilled today to have a few special guests with us. Before we get to that, we want to do some quick thank yous to our sponsors. Let's start with Nacodex. If you're building any products, digital or otherwise, make sure you connect with them. It's a mobile website, what have you. These guys have done a wonderful job for us. It's nacodex.com, and we'll include their link in the show notes as well. Also, a big thanks to Primero Negocios. If you're looking for local customers, they're the team to talk to, and they've also done some wonderful work for us too. And Strike Tax, amazing group that helps with R&D tax credits. So we'll have all this information further. But without any further ado, Peter, do you want to do a quick introduction for yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Peter Wang. Hi. I am a brand community manager at Intel, and I also just know everything about social media, specifically TikTok, but also other social media too, because I feel like nowadays it's probably better for me to, diversify.
Yeah, and salsa dancing too. He's a pretty good salsa dancer. So great. Let's do some quick introductions. We have Samira Khan, and we also have Prince Kudra as well. So thank you so much for joining. We're thrilled to have you both here and talking about thinking greater than ourselves. So how and why to have a positive impact and change in the teams that we build. So maybe we'll get things kicked off. Samira, would love to hear a little bit about yourself and your background. So thank you so much for joining.
Yeah, sure. So Samira Khan, as mentioned, I'm at Microsoft. I'm on the global public affairs team, but before that was working at the intersection of tech and impact, and just very passionate about impact on some of the most marginalized communities globally. So I've done a lot of work in that space in different parts of the world.
Beautiful, thank you.
Fantastic. It's a pleasure to share I'm actually with all of you on this table, and thank you for having me, Nick.
My pleasure.
Thank you for having us. I am Kudra Kalema. I guess probably the best way to explain who I am and what I do is that I'm in the business of people. I am, I guess, fortunate that this has been something that our family, or my family, has been in for over a millennia. We've been considered the custodians of our land for that long, and we continue to be the custodians of more than just the land and the people on it, but also what comes of it. And when you start talking about that, you really can't talk about anything other than impact, social good, and doing things in large systematic ways. So that's really what I've dedicated the last, I'd say, decade and a half of my life. And I'm so blessed to actually be here in Silicon Valley to interact with such great minds that can really push that impact in ways in which I don't think my people would have ever imagined. So that's why I'm pleased to be here. Thank you.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, we certainly have an amazing stage and group here, and the ability to tap into a lot of really impactful channels as well, being in San Francisco here. Also, a shout out to the amazing group at Berber. So thank you so much for hosting us. Really thrilled. And Samira, let's start with yourself. When we're thinking about building teams and inspiring others to have an impact at scale, I mean, that feels foundational to retention, to motivation, to inspiration. What does that look like for you?
Yeah, I think when we talk about motivating teams, one really has to start with themselves and reflect on what is most important to you and what is most important in your environment. And I think by defining your values, you stay more grounded. So otherwise, it becomes very high level rhetoric and language, and it doesn't really feel personal to you. So to give you a tangible example, you know, I grew up being exposed to a lot of countries that had significant poverty. And so when I think and reflect on what's important to me, I think of people who lead very different lives than myself and how can I affect change. When I think of my life today, I have children. So I think about the lens of what will the future world look like and how is what I'm doing today impacting everything around me. So just that those two things, even though it may not directly relate to my team or my work day to day, it keeps me grounded in this notion that there's something beyond myself. So I think if you can think about how personal it is and you can sort of picture those things, you stay connected to the side of you that is more caring, that is more connected, that is more reflected, that's sort of rooted in gratitude, and you show up differently to all of your interactions, including your teams. Does that make sense? It's more from the inside out.
It sounds like if you have like a personal relationship with the end goal, with the mission statement, it's going to really show through to how you manage your teams or how you even curate a product or really everything.
If you implement this code of ethics, how do you make sure that the team actually stays accountable?
Yeah, I think accountability is a little bit different from what I discussed. So I was just starting with ground zero, each person thinking about their backgrounds, their lives, where they come from, what's important to them, and then kind of grounding themselves in, I do care about other people. This is not just about me. Because ultimately, if you look at the corporate structure and sort of profitability and the way in which we've kind of organized the for-profit sector, it is very much driven by the I mentality and not the we mentality. So in order to organize people around the we mentality, I think they first need to be better in touch with themselves. And then accountability is really about it showing up in your sort of goals and whatnot, but it's really about being accountable to yourself. So I think if you have the right culture, and there's a lot baked into that, then it shows up. So it's that culture you're co-creating, that narrative you're co-creating, and it starts with yourself and being honest with yourself.
Do you want to add to that, there? Creating culture?
Absolutely, I wholeheartedly agree with that. I think, there are a lot of things that happen in our world, or a lot of ideas and visions that we have in our world right now that sometimes neglect some of the things that that our predecessors, our forefathers and foremothers had put some significant thought into, which is that how well we've intertwined culture with the way that they operate. And so right now we find ourselves, and when I say we, I'm talking about some of the projects that we're working on, where we find ourselves asking the question, what does it mean to set up, for example, a solar project in the middle of Uganda, right? And the roads that go from that project all the way to the capital city. What does that mean in terms of the effect it'll have on culture? If the majority of the people who are living there have easy access to the city, does that mean that they're all going to move to the city? Does that mean that they're all going to leave their farms behind and they're going to have spending more time in the city, and then they're going to have children there, and those children are going to grow up and they're probably going to speak the language of commerce, which might be English, or it might be Swahili, for example, in Uganda. And what does that mean for the indigenous languages? So a lot of times in our pursuit to modernize, in our pursuit to progress, we might not put as much effort or as much thought into what that means in terms of our culture. Because we are creating a new culture that's slightly different from the past, but what does that mean about our previous culture, the culture from before? And yes, I totally agree with what you're saying. I think it's really important to have that, and I think it does also come. It initially comes from inside. It comes from the individual and how the individual works within a team, and what that means in terms of that team's culture.
It's like the sum is greater than the whole of its parts. Did I get that right? Or is it the whole is greater than the sum of its parts? It almost makes sense. Like when I picture what you're saying, it almost makes sense in a marketing kind of way, because in a way you are marketing yourself when you talk to others about your project, and based on how you talk about it, the passion can come through, and eventually it can attract people who also believe in what you are doing more than like the monetary gain. It's also a really good way to figure out who in a scene is fake versus who in the scene is real, which.
So what was the hiring process like Intel at? Because like you're mentioning, you want to, and like Samira mentioned as well, you want to find the right people that are going to be cohesive with you in your organization. What was that process like to make sure that you had the right cultural fit for your team?
Well, let's see. I know that my interview with Ray went over for 45 minutes because we talked about TikTok starting at the end of the actual interview. I was supposed to be hired on to do Twitter.
Yeah.
And I never actually touched Twitter. A little bit. Yeah. But a lot of it was during the interview process, we focused more about strategy. And I think that's where I kind of guided the interview to go to. And I'm going to stop talking about the interview process now, just in case it might get me more in trouble. But I have one thing that really surprised me though about working at Intel, in 2021 till now, is how much they do care about mental health. I wonder if it's all of Intel or if it's just the marketing team.
Sure.
But there was that was a huge push, and that push was started by John Coyne, the ex-managing director of the marketing team. He made a point to really check in with teams. He wanted to make sure what every single team is doing. Because he focused a lot on how much your workload is. That culture kind of petered down into my relationship with my direct boss, and even now, I have a lot of one-on-ones where they would just check in with me and say how's your workload? Are you getting overwhelmed? Is everything? Do you have bandwidth for other projects? Blah blah blah. So even though he left, that his legacy is still there.
Samira, what about Microsoft? Have you seen that mental health is having a big impact in how senior executives like yourself connect with your teams?
I mean, I think the pandemic in general was tough for a lot of teams. That's why we're seeing a cultural push to come back to work so people can sort of interact in person, etc. So that's certainly a piece of it. Kind of building off of what you were saying with regards to the recruitment process, I think Microsoft does attract a lot of talent that is committed to having a positive impact on the world just because they are doing so much in so many different spaces. Diversity and inclusion, social entrepreneurship, AI for good, etc. So they tend to attract change makers, and I think when they're interviewing, the questions are some of them are around culture as well. So I think that helps. But in terms of mental health, I think it's been tough across the board. I think any one company is not alone, and that's just an uphill battle from the pandemic onward. Yeah.
What about empathy? Is that an important element to making sure you connect with the right folks?
Yeah, no, empathy is a huge part of our culture at large. I used to work on a program called Empathy in Action.
Cool.
When I joined Microsoft US, I've switched roles a bit, but yeah, no, it was huge. And the way in which it manifested is community partnerships. So particular teams would try to get closer to communities and really include that voice in design, program design, product design, looking at it through different lenses like sustainability, social impact, etc. And I think that is the key, that like embedding yourself more in communities, and the extent to which leaders can actually have the time and space to do that, the better. It is hard enough for them to even get outside of their sort of executive cabinet, so to speak. So I think that's a lot to ask, but I think we need to consciously build it into the corporate system, that leaders are getting out there into the community so that it's more embedded in them, this sort of like leading with empathy aspect.
That must be why I love Windows 11 so much.
That is one of us. And what about yourself, Kudra? In building teams, have you found that empathy is an important characteristic to look for? And what kind of questions can you share with us that highlight that?
Absolutely. First of all, I want to quickly touch on the mental aspect, and I think I often try to look for blessings in everything, and I think COVID was somewhat of a blessing for us. It was a blessing in that it helped us start talking more about our mental health in a way in which we never did before, and in certain cultures, going back to the culture aspect of it, in certain cultures, it's easier to speak about mental health, and other cultures it's even harder. If you have a stomachache, you can call up your boss and say, "I'm not feeling too well. I've got a bit of a stomachache here." And your boss will be like, "Okay, fine, don't come in." But if you say, "I'm not feeling mentally all right," it's almost impossible to get, because that's not really within our culture. And it's the same thing. It's actually probably even more important to consider that, because if I go into a meeting and I'm not mentally ready for it, I'm less likely to perform well.
Exactly.
Than if I had a stomachache. I might be able to, just grit my teeth and get through it.
Yeah.
And so we almost got a bit of a blessing. I think we did get a blessing with COVID, because people started talking more about mental health, and the notion of needing a mental rest day has become almost common talk now. Correct me if I'm wrong. And so I think that's such an important thing. When it comes to empathy, I think empathy is so important not only in groups, but I believe it's one of the most important things in leadership. And I don't know too much about leadership. I'm only learning that a little bit now. I really am. I learn more about leadership on a daily basis, primarily because I begrudgingly got into the position that I'm in. But one of the key components of leadership is empathy.
Who are some of the leaders that you admire?
Oh, good heavens. Well, first I'm going to tell you about a really good book.
Cool.
It's called The Leadership Lab, by Pippa Malmgren, I think is one of the authors. And they go through all of the different leaders in the world, different types of leaders, Fortune 500s, political leaders, religious leaders, rabbis,
maybe pop culture too.
Pop culture, leaders on the football field, Cristiano Ronaldo, and they try to find out what are the things that are common in all these leaders, and empathy is actually one of them to make a good leader. But some of the leaders that I do really respect are ones that have figured out a way to galvanize different types of people. along the same type of cause. A lot of times you find that in the religious realm. Desmond Tutu was a great leader, and he coined a term, and that, the reason why he comes to my mind first is that he coined the term Ubuntu, which is about
Togetherness.
togetherness.
Right.
The real, I might butcher what he said, but it was really sort of, you can't really understand yourself unless if you see yourself through the eyes of others. But he used the term Ubuntu, which is actually a term that comes from a lot of the Bantu languages, all the Bantu languages, which is, for those of you who are not familiar, a big part of Africa constitute the Bantu languages. It's almost like Latin, I guess, or the Romantic languages in Europe. And they stem from the bottom of Nigeria all the way to South Africa. Zulu is a Bantu language, Luganda is a Bantu language, Swahili is a Bantu language. And in that Bantu language, they all have a certain root. Bantu, Muntu, Untu, Buntu. All of those mean people. And all of the languages come from that root of that word, meaning togetherness, meaning community.
Yeah.
That nothing actually works without that. And so I'll have to put, to long-windedly answer your question, I'll have to put Desmond Tutu up there and one of those leaders, yes.
Yeah, so about a month ago we had Dr. Aka Apawele from the Côte d'Ivoire, and he really struck me, especially since you mentioned that, about the ability to galvanize people together. That's it's an art and a skill, pretty remarkable to be able to do that consistently and across so many different disparate groups.
It really is, and if you consider when Desmond Tutu was doing this, when he coined that term, was right after apartheid, where you had, not just people from different religions, but people who had totally different ideologies, right?
Yeah.
You had the white South Africans, black South Africans, and he was able to have a galvanizing effect on all of them, alongside obviously the great Nelson Mandela, and he did it in a different way, and so I think that's, but all of them came from empathy. That is the one common thread.
Yeah,
that type of
good
leadership
foundation.
comes from empathy. Yeah.
What are some other good characteristics when thinking greater than ourselves?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is very much a discipline, and I think I'm coming from the corporate sector. So for me, it's very much a practiced thing because our day-to-day lives are so hectic and busy. So it's like prayer, it's like gratitude, it's really putting yourself in somebody else's shoes, taking a step back. Otherwise, you just don't have the time. I think part of it's innate, but part of it is actually process and practice and discipline. It's almost like a daily meditation and a daily pause. So I think having those strong habits are really important, and finding and identifying leaders and rewarding leaders for those habits that may not necessarily lead to the right business decision in the near term, but it's the longer sort of important decision for the company culture or for the team culture. Does that make sense? It's super high level.
It sounds challenging though, just because corporate America is so focused on the near-term profit, and in reality, just like you mentioned, these are longer-term strategies. How can you kind of marry the two to keep both sides happy, would you say?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is just how we reward leaders, and so there's a bottoms-up aspect of it. Like, what are we going to stand for? Corporations are not democracies, so we don't get to vote our leaders in, but there are signals that we send to them. And I think, we often put a lot of burden on topmost leadership to drive culture when it can very much be a bottoms-up movement. We're just as responsible for coaching. Like, my children teach me so much every day, and they're young, right? So similarly, we can teach others so much regardless of position, and having that learning culture, I think, is important.
Yeah.
I think also storytelling is a good win too, because if we from like a startup to a corporate perspective, at the end of the day, when people are so far removed from whatever teams that they are managing, and everything exists as a spreadsheet, if we're able to attribute like a narrative to that spreadsheet and bring some sort of like story to why the numbers are increasing, why the numbers are decreasing, why we should pay attention to like this particular column versus the other, then we are able to at least like help guide the upper management. At least that's been my experience.
Yeah, because like emotion comes in and reason leaves, but I guess if you're incentivizing and to some degree it's like gamification in the reward mechanism, that can be super powerful. What are good ways to reward teams and executives to make sure they're on the right track for sustainability and social impact? That's to both of you.
I mean, I worked in impact management for a good while, and a lot of it was about having the right metrics, having the right systems in place, but ultimately it came down to culture in terms of the longevity. So if it's not rooted in the leaders and it's not rooted in the sort of purpose and drive of the teams and the company, it's going to fall to the wayside when business decisions need to be made. So I think it comes back to your point around cultural transformation and what are the sources of that, whether it's sort of a leader or it's sort of a language, or what brings people together. What are those things? What are those cultural artifacts, aspects? You asked about a leader. Brené Brown is someone that we read at Microsoft, and she's an author I love. She has so much in there, but how do you really embody that and sort of manifest some of those values is really important. So I think there's different ways to anchor it. The arts, writing, language, curiosity, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think going back to the first bit, you're talking about the metrics of it, and I think this ties in with what you're talking about to begin with, is where do you start from? Like having a good understanding of what it is that you're trying to do, that informs the type of metrics you're looking for, and once you get to see those, that's when you can begin to reward whoever's put those things into place and into the strategies into place. But it is built around the type of culture that you have, and understanding what is necessary for the community in which you serve, I think is really, really important. Unfortunately, I'm going to do something I don't usually like doing, which is I'm going to turn this to another question to you, because I think you have a better understanding of this. Unfortunately, because there's something I've always wanted to know, just when you were talking about it, I realized that you have the experience to be able to answer this question that I don't understand. I don't know the answer to, which is how, when working with impact as a company the size of Microsoft, how do you deal with the executives to steer them along the way in which they provide the right type of impact that is needed for the community in which they're trying to serve, as opposed to the impact that might be the flavor of the month, or might be the thing
that's
that,
a good question.
that work. Because for example, 2 years ago, everyone was talking about vaccination, right? And everyone was that was sort of what everyone wanted to do, and there was so much money was going into that, but not a lot of money was going into, for example, refugees who also needed vaccinations, by the way. And then we had the war in Ukraine, and it all shifted. We're talking about food shortage. We're talking about food security. We're talking about refugees, and so how do you balance that? How do you balance with all the things that are going on in the world and the communities, with making sure that the execs, the people that make these decisions in an organization like Microsoft are going to cater to those?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think it's highly valuable. A couple of caveats. So, current role doesn't have anything to do with impact.
Right.
Prior role touched upon it, and previous to that, I was at a different tech company working in impact. But I can speak more broadly in terms of what I've seen. You're absolutely right that the tide changes, and you will see priorities shift. And this type of sustainable change requires long-term investment, long-term time horizons, long-term commitment. So completely agree with you. I think one approach could be really to empower the employees for whom that cause is very important, with more resources to do that long-term sort of organizing, to innovate, to help them organize themselves so that it's almost like a multi-track movement coming from within the company itself. So I think empowering employees is a huge piece of it, and that's very important to Microsoft. To the extent to which companies can do that, I think the better off they'll be at achieving those outcomes. Maybe not at a corporate level, but by virtue of having given more to their employees to drive the change, right? So that's part of it. And I'd say secondarily, like I think it's just for Microsoft and for a tech company, it is about the tech, right? So they have to think about where can their tech have the greatest impact in the short term and the long term. So it might be on the pandemic today, and after a certain period of time, it might be on some other sort of crisis that the world is facing, because technology is so pervasive to our lives. So you want to bring it around urgency, right? You want to kind of organize it around urgency. But I hope that helps. It's just my perspective.
It does help. It does help. Yes.
And wow, wonderfully put, Samira. I love how you said that. So let's go into, we've got a couple questions from the audience as well. I think, Peter, do you want to ask a few here?
No, but I have a question.
Okay.
This is more around just the concept of creating a company to elicit social change. And this question I actually have consistent debates with my cousin. My cousin is more on the policy side. He lives in Minneapolis, and he always tells me, if you're watching this, Carrie, hi, I'm about to call you out. Sorry. It's for the views. He always says, like, Peter, you're so idealistic and so, like, you're so Silicon Valley when you go about this. And this kind of brings up this debate that we have, and at the root of it, it's incentivization versus, what's that word? Versus
The stick.
the stick, right? What is the government word for the stick? Restrictions. No, sanctions or incentivizations versus like I guess sanctions. Like is there a balance? Because his argument is saying that like kind of what you just touched on, because companies do have a tendency to greenwash versus actually provide green solutions. So at what point does the government regulation? That's the word.
Okay.
At what point does regulation need to come in, and are we able to? And is the balance more regulation with a little bit of incentivization, or can we go like full 100% carrot with this?
Well, I guess it depends what kind of cake you're baking to determine how much heat you put on it, right? Or how long you keep it in the oven, right? And so it depends what type of problem you're trying to solve to determine whether or not you're going to go through the policy route or through a different route, right? And there are a lot of things within, for example, here in the US, I know that you set up a nonprofit and there's certain things that you have to do if you're if you're a public charity, then you have to get a certain, I think 33% has to come from small donations. So that in a way sort of guarantees that you're going to be getting a lot of input from the community in which you serve, right? But that's not enough. And so it needs to be balanced with a really good mission and a good vision that's run by the people who run the nonprofit. So the policy is doing a bit of its work, but then also the actual vision and the mission of the nonprofit has to do the other bit. And you have to have the right type of board. That's why, for example, if you're having a public charity, your board cannot be just full of like family members or people who are all in the same company. So you're going to have that diversity, and they're going to challenge each other to make sure that mission is actually on point, and they're staying on point with it, and they continually serve. And if they don't do that, they won't be able to get those donations from the small, 33% from like small donations, and the other percent from And so I think it really works hand in hand. And if you do it correctly, I think most of the time you have good results.
I think you can, I love how you put that. I think you can approach it almost like the scientific method to some degree. Like, how does an entrepreneur operate? Well, they try something, they see if it works, and then if it doesn't, they pivot, right? Well, I know that Sam Altman is doing something kind of similar in regards to Microsoft as far as a limited benefit where it can be a nonprofit, but they're throttling the amount of capital that the investors can make. And I think that's kind of an interesting hybrid approach to staying close to the original goals of the group, but also making it lucrative in an environment where, obviously that's part of the goal for these LPs.
Yeah, I know. I love that you spoke about shifting the model and sort of the parameters of the model and what becomes the norm and the consultative or challenging piece of it, where if you have the right stakeholders, they'll challenge each other. So I think those two are very powerful concepts because policy takes time to develop and it's even harder in certain markets to rely on policy. So I think it's really about this model shift that you're speaking of.
And not everybody always plays nicely together. For example, one of my favorite books is called The $1 Trillion Coach. It was written by Eric Schmidt of Google about a fellow named Bill Campbell, who is the personal coach for Steve Jobs and Larry and Sergey and a bunch of local Silicon Valley rock stars. And he, early on at Google, he came up with this idea when there were two leaders that couldn't necessarily agree on something. He would put them in charge and say, hey, the success of this project is it's delegated to you both. So figure it out, or us. And it's kind of like put two cats into a room together and they sort it out. I don't know.
They turn into a dog.
So it's kind of an interesting approach to getting people to work together. But along those lines of collaboration and helping folks, again, think greater themselves, what are some best practices for facilitating proper collaboration?
Do you want to take that?
I can start it and then I think for collaboration, ironically, actually it's important to understand what your role is. I think that's a really key piece of it. Just clarity of role and collective vision, because everyone can't do everything, right? So I've noticed either teams over-indexing on the collaboration, so very large sort of meetings or situations where decisions aren't getting made, things aren't moving forward, or they are leaving certain people feeling excluded. So the extent to which you can have clarity of role and, being able to drive that vision collectively, I think it's very important. It's not the most interesting part of what you asked, but I do think that process piece is huge. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, indeed, I wholeheartedly agree with that. It's also going back to making sure you have the right people involved and they can align along the cultural aspect of it.
That's true.
Right?
Yeah.
If they can't, then you're always going to have an uphill battle from the get-go.
Yeah.
And so either you're going to have to spend the first bit of that collaborative process figuring out how to align in terms of culture, or it just might, the two cats might actually just each other apart, right?
I would say ego or lack thereof is a huge one. I got to experience some of this actually. Part of my job is helping create content for Intel's TikTok channel, and I feel like it's because TikTok was such a new platform that people who previously had ego with social media came in and learned and saw everything that they're supposed to do and was like, oh no, I'm not going to touch this with a 10-foot pole. So this kind of presented a really interesting environment, because now the interns or the younger employees that just started, who are more closely related to the platform itself, found the courage to kind of speak up and almost take control of the meeting. That's kind of part of the success of where we were able to get where we are, is we listen to the voices of the interns and the first year marketing people who actually use TikTok.
Is that generational? Because I feel like traditionally, a lot of folks just don't want to rock the boat.
I mean, I never got that memo, I guess. I kind of rocked it.
You're rocking and rolling.
Yeah, and we actually use this process. Sorry, I just want to share this one thing. We actually hopped on a call with Microsoft and had a little collaboration session on TikTok for that, and we used this processing it came out. We had a pretty productive call. So
Yeah. No, I mean, I think what you said is really interesting about product having meaning. Like, that's really important. So that goes back to like vision and kind of centering people. One thing I'm curious about, now I'm going to do the whole posing the question thing,
Fantastic.
is people wear so many different masks and they have so many personas. There's all this language about bringing your full self to work. I've yet to, I believe, meet a person who actually fully does that. So what does that look like? How do you create teams that are kind of shedding those masks and bringing their full selves to work? I've seen lots of like barriers to it and twists and turns, and I think it's one of those things that just can spiral downward for certain teams. So curious if anyone has any experience with that, like shedding masks. Yeah.
Yeah, I think a lot of the stuff you need to front end. You need to try to sort it out from the get-go. And so we've touched on a couple of points. Selflessness. Making sure that it's clear from the get-go that the culture you're talking about is one where no one owns anything. We're just caretakers for a certain period of time. This is not a one-man race, it's a relay. You know, you hold the baton for a little bit and then you pass it on to the next person. When you understand that, then you automatically start shedding that ego. Another thing that we work with in the social good sector is being able to embed redundancy in whatever you do, so that you know that whatever project you're working on, you know that there's an end date where you're not going to be needed anymore, and whatever community or whoever you're serving will be able to do it on their own. And so it's very difficult to go into an approach like that and kind of feel like you need to, you need to be someone else, because it wouldn't serve any purpose. It wouldn't serve any purpose to come with a mask when you know that, one, it's not your baby, two, you're just taking care of it for a short while, and even if you believed it, you can see from the get-go there's a redundancy that's built into it, so you're not going to be able to hold on to it forever. And so that really helps with that. It also works as a litmus test, because there are some people who just might not get that, and then maybe they're not in the right team. Maybe you could move them to another team where that might work better. I suspect that certain aspects in business where it's important to wear a mask.
Can't not show your cards fully.
Yeah, I can't imagine. Maybe negotiations but in the social aspect, in the social good sector, it rarely yields any fruit.
I can imagine the letting go part is going to be particularly hard, especially if you're working in a corporation whose whole system is built around like, what have you accomplished?
Well, we reward people on what they've sort of, a part of our sort of mechanism is what have you contributed to somebody else's work and goals.
Oh.
So that's like one huge piece of it. And so I love that aspect of like sort of rewards and goals. So
Right. How do you measure
we do
that,
have
though?
that. I mean, you can articulate it as a narrative, like, I helped, I kind of supported so-and-so do that. It's very narrative format,
Sure.
but I think that's really cool. I think that's very forward-looking for a company, but I think it is hard, push comes to shove, right? Because I think ultimately how you're perceived by other people is often in I mode. Like, what did this person do versus what did this group do? And who was at the start of the journey, later in the journey? Because it's like people are on this journey together, and sometimes you forget about the people who start the journey. So, anyway.
Yeah, it's a cultural thing as well. I mean, in our culture here, and particularly in the US, I is a word we use a lot.
Yeah, exactly.
In other cultures, we is a word we use a lot. And so, but that can be learned, and that can be cultivated, even in this.
It really sounds like if we're really creating products for social change, we kind of have to change the way we think a company has to be structured.
Yeah.
Well, we are progressing, like even biologically. Like if you look at 1900, the average age was 32 when we passed, right? And now we've like over tripled that to some degree. So I guess it only makes sense that we socially have progressed as well. What do you think? Speaking of progression in that capacity, where do you think we'll be in another like 15 to 30 years, Kudra?
with regards to what? To
Social progressive development. Hopefully we're not so open-minded that our brains fall out, but obviously be more accepting of others.
I think a lot of it depends on how much work some of us do and how much support we get. I know, for example, at COP27 last year, it got extended by a few days because of what the poorer nations were complaining about. They're complaining about how the wealthier nations have made their wealth by using fossil fuels and polluting the planet, and now the poorer nations have the opportunity to make some wealth, and they've been told, no, you can't, right?
Right.
And so that was something that, whether or not the wealthy nations were planning to, has already began to plant the seed of empathy in them. If they weren't going to think about the side of the table that the poorer nations were sitting on before COP27, they sure as hell are thinking about it now.
Yeah.
And it's going to come back up again in COP28 in Dubai in a few months. And so, if we continue to push in this way, from the bottom up, because we're going to be influenced by the younger people who are going to buy the products that we make, whether it's Microsoft and all of that, they're going to say, you've got to do this in the right way, you've got to make sure that the lithium batteries in our phones are coming from proper sources, you've got to make sure that we're doing it in a sustainable way and there's not child labor and all of these things. It's going to force us to have to push that to the executive level, and the executive level is going to force policy. And so, once again, this long-winded answer to you is, in 15 years, I think not only will we have industry thinking about these problems in a different way, but I also think policy will also be crafted in a different way.
Because that's where the rubber hits the road.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Samira, when we were talking in preparation for the show today, you shared a little bit about narrowing the universe, which I like how you put that, because it's, on one hand, it's important to focus, but on the other hand, it's also good to have perspective and see the forest through the trees. How do you walk the line between these two thought processes or concepts?
That's such a big question, and I'm going to build off of some of what you said earlier in terms of the seeds. So I think we need to grow those seeds, like you said, collectively. And I think I am most concerned about the poorer nations. And I do think there is something around regulatory innovation, so how policy is developed, which comes down to how we seek input and feedback from individuals and get them to open up. So when I talked about narrowing the universe, I was talking about any one given person. You can't solve all of the sustainable development goals or do everything. So really figuring out what speaks most to you and focusing your energy there in terms of, building the right sort of group of people to work with, finding your tribe, your fellow change makers, and kind of organizing and orienting yourself in that way, and corporations, to the extent that they can help support those people, great. So that's kind of what I was talking about, because if you think about poorer nations, they're suffering from so many different things: food insecurity, climate justice issues, gender empowerment. And for someone who cares about something like that, which is the fundamental nature of a lot of people in this room, that can be dizzying. It can make you physically sick, and you feel like you can't do that much and you're not making progress.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you have to find ways to narrow, focus, prioritize, right?
Yeah. When you said innovation policy, that really hits, because it's interesting. On one hand, we have technology, which is going at breakneck speed, a runaway train.
Policy, not so much.
Yeah. Do we take technology, or do we take policy to try to fit tech in kind of like a round peg in a square hole? I think I said that backwards or whatever.
Yes.
Or do we try to create an entirely new infrastructure of legal support and frameworks to adopt these quickly changing the technology space? I'm not sure there's a right answer for that question. But.
Well, I think a lot of times, like with most technologies, it's very rare that one technology totally annihilates another. So it's very rarely where, the car came about, and it wasn't like we never saw horses again, right? There's still places for people riding horses and carriages right now, right? And so it's a combination of both. There's certain aspects of policy that can move at Silicon Valley speed, but the other aspects that don't need to move at that speed. The other aspects that need to be done in a deliberative manner so that we can make sure that we have long-term success, right?
For everybody.
For everybody,
Yeah.
right? And if you're going to sort that out in a 15-minute lunch meeting, you might be in trouble, right? You might be in trouble. Now, it might be really, the appropriate thing to institute a policy that regarding, I don't know, one of the first couple of weeks when we had COVID. Maybe that works then. But do you understand? And so it's a combination of both, and it's about having the right team. And touching on to what you were also saying in terms of, and also what you were asking about perspective. The team is so important. And having people who see the same thing in a different way, apparently, forgive me, I have these stories, but apparently in the strict form of chess, you're not allowed to stand up. You're not allowed to stand up while playing chess, because you'll see the chessboard from a different perspective as the person who's sitting down. It's an unfair advantage. But in business, you want to have that. You want to have someone standing up, you want to have someone in the corner over there, you want to have someone underneath the table. You want to have as many, and so the way that you do that is by having people who have different backgrounds. You want to make sure on your board you have a good representation of women, you have people of color, you want to have everything that you can, because if you don't do that, you're putting yourself in a disadvantage.
Yeah.
And try to avoid silos, like echo chambers.
Yeah, you don't want to do that. Unfortunately, Silicon Valley is not very great at that, by the way. And it's something that we really need to work on. We really need to work much harder on, right? We really need to work on having more women in tech. We need to have more people of color in tech. And we'll end up having better products. We'll end up having better tech.
I think KPMG even had done, or maybe it was Deloitte, had done a report on that, like quantifiably, the more diverse your team is, like the better financial performance you're going to have. It's kind of ironic that it took this long in the last couple of years, right?
It's obvious.
Yeah. And when, Samira, when you're leading a business, when you're leading a business meeting, how do you start the meeting? Do you have any tips or tricks for getting what's on people's minds out on the table? Do you ask them about their day?
Yeah.
What's your secret?
I mean, I've been in many different sort of meeting formats, and I do think that personal connection in the beginning works well if you can. Asking people how their day is, what they did over the weekend, any sort of like icebreakers, for lack of better words. They can be quite generic though, so if you keep using the same ones, you don't really get much of a response, right? So I think it has to be genuine, and it has to be from a place of, I'm genuinely committed to the journey of getting to know you as a human being.
Wow.
And so I don't know if in all team meetings everyone is committed to that journey. So the extent to which I think you feel that, your questions naturally will be oriented toward who the person is, and kind of you'll be more engaged in their lives. I don't know.
Yeah, brilliantly put. Peter, how do you do active listening?
With no parts. Did you ever experience from 2020 from 2021 to the start of 2022, when people are kind of going into the office for hybrid work? Did you ever notice how like team meetings got a little bit awkward?
Yes.
Indeed.
Or is it just me? I think
Microsoft Teams or actual Teams?
Well, I kept on trying to press the mute button, and I couldn't. I kept on trying to press the mute button, and I couldn't because I was so used to.
I'm so glad that's never happened. I'm so glad. I'm really glad that in Teams the mute button's right here, and the biggest button ever in the keyboard.
So we got about 5 minutes left or so. I wanted to see if we could do the song. Do we have the conscious conversations? Oh, perfect. Cool. Samira, you get to pick for us today.
I just pick a card?
Yeah.
This is
Okay.
for the
I've never
So
done
this
this
is
before.
this is improv at its best
Okay.
right here. So this is from our friend Jules Bonasata, who created this awesome game called Conscious Conversations.
Hi, Jules.
Yeah, to the camera. So great. So please, you want to read this for us?
Sure. I'll read it for you.
She has no idea what this is.
What is the most trouble you've ever been in?
Oh, jeez. Can we cut the commercial?
So I'm just reading it, right?
Yes.
Okay, you're just reading.
Are we going to answer that?
This is live, by the way. I'll go first.
Mine's easy. One time I got a C.
Please.
One time I got a C
Okay.
in math, and that was like really bad.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I'm a great kid.
Yeah. I feel like you were probably a troublemaker. Were you a good kid when you were growing up?
Skip. You're good.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, so I remember I was going to a concert with some friends, and we were drinking a couple beers outside, and you're not supposed to do that, as it turns out. And I ran from the police, but when I finally got caught, and they put me in the drunk tank for the night. I didn't have anything on my record, and I learned my lesson. That was so that's me being very vulnerable right now. So, but I came to have a definite appreciation for authority and make sure you play by the rules, because you want to set yourself up for success later. So, same question.
Indeed. Oh crikey, I can't. I think it must have been once on. It must have been once on the rugby field. I used to, when I was younger, I used to love rugby, and I was a fairly decent player, I guess. And I remember it was a really big game, and we were down by, I think, 4 points. And I got the ball, I was on the wing.
Yeah.
And I went round, I ran round one player. And instead of putting the ball down, in rugby you actually have to place the ball down, you don't just have to cross the line. I tried to go all the way underneath the poles, and I tried to do this whole like Harlem Globetrotter thing around my back, and I dropped the ball, and we didn't score the try, we lost the game.
Oh wow.
So
Practice before the fall.
yeah, we lost, and I got into a lot. I had to run laps for the rest of the week.
Yeah.
It was a Saturday game, and the whole week I was just doing.
Yeah.
The rest of the team were practicing.
Ridiculed.
I was just doing laps of the field. It was just yeah.
So what did you learn throughout that process?
Well, I guess just don't count your chickens.
Yeah.
Your chicks until they hatch.
That
Like
makes
you know,
sense.
like I thought I'd done it. I thought I was celebrating. I thought
Yeah. Take the win.
Yeah, I was trying to impress a girl.
Yeah.
It wasn't
Typical.
good. Yeah, it wasn't good.
We've never done that, by the way.
No, of course not.
Yeah, so I think this might be one of those diversity at the table things, because I interpreted trouble as my being in trouble, not my causing trouble.
Yeah.
So that's how I'm going to answer the question.
Okay.
I would say the most trouble I've ever been in is probably something I can't speak about, so I'll go for the second most. I was in Nepal after the earthquake, and I decided that I was going to help deliver these maternal kits to moms who had been in areas affected by the earthquake, and it was a bad idea. Humanitarian aid should never be done by individuals going to the country, but I just thought that was the right thing to do. I showed up there. I didn't know how to get to these places, posted on Facebook and hitched a ride with a group of 4 men on like a vehicle where I was sitting on top of these rice bags, and I went out to a rural area, right, to deliver the kit. So far, so good. On the way back, it was dark. I started feeling a little uncomfortable. And none of my phone wasn't working or anything like that. So I guess I just learned, about safety and just, that feeling like what am I doing? I don't know these people. Nothing happened, but it was just that feeling. And the other day I was reading on LinkedIn, somebody posted like 5 things that they've experienced or that women experience, and there was like thousands of comments. Like, I've experienced all those 5 things. So women just sometimes are in trouble. They feel this sense of trouble in certain environments. So anyway,
What
that's
can
totally.
men do to be a little bit more conscious and thoughtful of something that they may be blind spots for
And
us?
I don't think it's a male-female thing. I think it's any vulnerable person in a situation where, I think that what I was talking about was, maybe more applicable to the female context, but it could be any vulnerable person. It's just safety. I think people view safety through the lens of the experiences they've had, right? And I'm generally quite laissez-faire about some safety things as opposed to some other people I know, but yeah, I mean, it could just be, I guess just being more mindful of your surroundings. There's no easy answer to that one, yeah.
But I think we would be remiss, all men, if we didn't acknowledge the fact that the world we live in is a world where we don't have to think about safety as much as women do. And that's something that, we really have to work on. And it's a real shame.
Yeah. So definitely take that for granted.
Sorry to take it a different direction.
No,
I mean, this is supposed to be
no.
lighthearted, yeah.
So I guess let's in the final couple of minutes we have here. Let's turn it to the audience. Are there any questions that you have for these two brilliant minds up here around creating impact at scale?
That's where the mic comes in.
Someone, if you can come grab this, Samira? Or yeah, good. You got a question? Back here. Yeah, go ahead.
So I'm tempted to ask two questions. So the first question is, what is an example of tech for impact that you found to be particularly exciting, that you've been part of or that you've seen? And then for your colleague, I'm sorry I forget your name, but I'm curious about your experiences as part of a royal family, and what kinds of insights might apply that you take from your life upbringing in such an environment of dignity and community. How do you translate some of those insights into your work in Tech for Impact?
Yeah, I think there's two things that have excited me over time. One is this notion of wearables and how bringing technology closer to your body in so many ways, and the healthcare applications of that. That's super exciting to me. I'm keen to see where it goes moving forward. And I think it's a much more drier subject, but impact management and just being able to help companies think of their goals differently and quantify things that they haven't measured in the past. And that's primarily because it's something I've worked on for a long time. And then the last piece would be disability inclusion, like how much tech can do for diverse learners or those who need a little support, especially in the absence of having human support in certain countries and markets because you don't have enough trained people to deliver that kind of support, whether it's healthcare around a certain disability, occupational therapy, physical therapy. Like, so much can be done through video, tech, changing your product design. So those are some of the things, basically, exciting.
Fantastic. So I've had, most of my life was rather dichotomous, which was that I was born at a time when our country was going through a civil war. And so we immediately had to leave the country, hence the way I have a weird accent that you probably don't think sounds like a Ugandan accent. But every day I basically had two different things where, I went home and I was treated like my title dictates, but anywhere else I was just anyone else. And because I also lived in the Western world, even though most people would have known what my title was, they definitely would not have treated me in the same way as I would have in my own hometown. And so I quickly got that thing that we were just talking about, which was a different perspective. And that's usually what I use in both ways. One, in being able to use the perspective of the Western world and see how we can adopt that in places like Uganda. And by the way, most of the world live like people in Uganda. And then also, how can I use what I know about my homeland and help inform the decisions that are made by people who are coming up with these designs and be able to deploy them. And the reason why I got into it in the first place was actually not for that purpose, was because I studied design. I have my master's in industrial design, but I quickly realized that the designs I was working with, there are only so many food apps that can work in the world, right? Because not the whole world don't have mobile phones and don't have cars that can deliver in fast food restaurants. So if you're only thinking about stuff that can work in Silicon Valley, you're gonna limit yourself at some point in time. You can only be so bright. So you have to start thinking about how the rest of the world operates, and once you have a bit of perspective of that, then I think that will inform better design ideas, and that will form ultimately better tech. If that sort of answers your question.
Any other questions here before we wrap up? Okay, great. Well, what a treat this has been, and just it feels very authentic and present. So thank you both very much. I very much appreciate it. And Peter, you're okay too.
Thanks so much.
Join us in 3 weeks. We'll have more of the best brains in the day. Until then, take care of yourselves and take care of each other. And check us out on siliconzombies.com. Thanks so much, everybody. Cool. Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Cheers.
It was
Wonderful
Thank
job.
you.
Wonderful job, both of you.
yes.
Yeah, you were able to pack in so